Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Right Hive annual conference panel, The Rules of Romance, a Genre Masterclass. My name is Steph, and I'll be your panel moderator today. I am very excited for you all to hear from our panelists on this topic, so I'd like to start by giving each of them a quick introduction. First, we have Ananya Devarajan. She's an undergraduate at the University of California, Irvine, pursuing a major in neurobiology and behavior with a minor in English. Like the majority of her characters, she is a second-generation Indian American young adult. Her love for storytelling began on Wattpad, where she grew her audience as a featured author, and she later went on to win first place in Teen Pit 2019. Now, Ananya writes young adult romance novels featuring dynamic Indian teenagers, lighthearted drama, and swoon-worthy banter. In her free time, she can be found watching her favorite Bollywood movies or studying for yet another organic chemistry exam. Ananya, welcome to our panel.
Thank you.
Next, we have Noreen Mughees, a South Asian Muslim writer who lives in New Jersey. She works as a public servant, and when she's not chasing a new plot, she loves to cook for her family and friends. Welcome, Noreen.
Hi, how are you? Sorry, it's like thunder booming here. So if you hear thunder in the background, that's what it is. I'm glad to be here with my fellow romance writers. My debut is coming out in October, and I'm all excited about it. My debut is called Misarrangement of Sana Saeed.
Congratulations. Next, we have R.J. Joseph, an award-winning Stoker Award nominated Texas-based academic and creative writer. She has had works published in various venues, including the streaming of Hill House essays on the Haunting Netflix series and the Halloween 2020 issue of Southwest Review. When she isn't writing, reading, or teaching, she can usually be found wrangling her huge blended family. RJ, thank you for being on this panel.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Stephanie.
I love it. All right, so we've come together to talk about the rules for romance. So why don't we go ahead and get to our questions, starting with, how did you first get started in writing romance? Was there an author who kicked off your love for the genre, or a friend who lent you a book and got you hooked? Like, how did it get started? So if we could start with Ananya.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a funny story when I talk about how I got into romance, so bear with me. But I've read romance my whole life. So I'm only 21 years old. My debut comes out actually in 3 days. So, most of my life has just been surrounded by romance in every single form. But that's not the first book I actually wrote. The first book I wrote was a mystery thriller novel that's still on Wattpad now. And I remember I wanted to pursue traditional publishing with it. And I sent it out to a few beta readers, and one beta reader got back to me, and I'll thank her forever for it. But she said, this book was awful. I could not get through it. I genuinely hated it. The only reason I got through it was because I liked the romantic B plot. Maybe you should consider doing that instead. And, I was 17 years old. I just graduated high school, and I was like, most authors tend to be 30, 40 years old. I got time to experiment, might as well. So I took her advice. I wrote Kiss My Connection, not thinking it would actually turn into my debut romance novel and that romance would just be this huge love that I now have inside of me. But I just kind of took a leap of faith, and here we are.
That's amazing. Brutal, but amazing.
Yeah.
Noreen, how about for you?
So I grew up in India reading Milton Boone, which is like the equivalent of Harlequin, I guess you would call it here. And I read it all my life. That was kind of my escape. Classics and romance, that's all I read. And more recently, I've gotten back into romance because there's a lot more representation of brown people in romance, and Uzma's books. Like for a while there, I stopped reading it because I was like, there's not enough representation in romance, which, kind of irked me for a while. But then as I started seeing more representation, I got back into romance. I have to say Uzma and Sajda's book, and, of course, the the great Beverly Jenkins, like, she's like, I love historical romance because of her and the representation that we saw in all her books. So yeah, I mean, I think I loved it for a while, and then I was like, these are not my stories, and these people don't look like me. So I stopped reading it, and then I sort of got back into it a few years ago.
Luckily for us, you did. That's great. RJ, how about for you?
Well, so I'm an old, and when I grew up, I was in a household that had tons of horror novels. And I don't know if you all remember those confession magazines. So like there was this whole line of magazines with romance short stories. Some were more spicy than others. And my parents, of course, were here in the South, United States. And so they were very adamant that they would hide those romance magazines and books from us. So of course I would go and sneak them anyway. And I started reading them, and my first professional writing sales were to those confessions magazines. And so once I started there, of course, there was the fan fiction romance with popular, bands back in the 80s. And so when I went into my MFA program, I went in as a romance writer. So my thesis was a romance novel, because a lot like Noreen, I just wanted to write these love stories about people that look like me, people that live like me. And so that's kind of my villain origin story.
I love it. And it's kind of relatable too. So that's perfect. So let's talk about what are some of your favorite tropes or themes to write about in your romances? Noreen, can we start with you on this one?
Sure. So my favorite tropes that the third book that I'm writing is still is the second chance and childhood, crushes to lovers. And of course, multicultural families and all the shenanigans that come with that. Um, I personally think, like, you're able to tell so much more of history if you have that, it sort of helps move the story along and who they are right now when you have that history with them. And I always loved that about second, and it's like, I could never do, I know it's another question of what tropes I hate. I could never do insta love. Like, that's like a trope that I could never write because, I don't know. It just seems like, it used to be popular back then, but that's just like one of my, I hate that trope. So I think the opposite of end of that is, something that, you've built upon over years, and how that relationship sort of changes as you grow up, and that intimacy that changes as you start to fall in love as adults, and things that they built upon. So yeah, those are my favorite tropes, and most of my books have that.
Okay, perfect. RJ, how about for you?
Well, some of my favorite themes to write about basically surround people that don't always find places in fantasy worlds. Like, for instance, parents of disabled children, older women, people that kind of live on the fringe of society as it is, because I feel like everybody deserves love. And I think that when we pull people from regular real life, I mean, I don't think that it dilutes that fantasy of the romance at all. For me, what it does is it kind of just brings back that thing that I'm always thinking about, is that everybody deserves love. Everybody deserves romance. Everybody deserves to kind of find their person or their people. So that's one of the things that I really like to play with in my romances, which is really great because I've been writing more horror for the past few years. And so it's really easy to infuse that romantic element when you have monsters, right? You have people who are monsters, or they're fighting the monsters, but they still need to make some time for romance. So, those are the things that I like to play around with. Everybody deserves to have that romantic moment.
I love that. Thank you. Ananya, how about for you?
Yeah, so I tend to write my favorite tropes. So what I like to read tends to be what I like to write. And so my debut is childhood best friends to lovers. It's found family. It's a little bit of like destiny and what it's like to fall in love with someone who is made for you by the universe. And I think like the kind of books I like to write is very magical concepts in contemporary romance because when you are in love, it feels like magic almost. So kind of bringing that out, especially when you have a bunch of 17-year-old teenagers falling in love for the first time, where it already feels really big and intense. I think that's kind of what I like to do. And then, but for my second book and moving onwards, I've been really into, like Noreen said, second chance romance. I just love the concept of two characters that tried to make it work, then couldn't make it work, and then are forced to develop as people, as individuals, and fight for this love because they think that it's more important than anything else in the world. I love the angst. I love the history. So all of that kind of combined are probably my favorite tropes in romance.
There's nothing better than like that angst in romance, in my opinion. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing too. Like I feel like second chance romance sometimes is harder for people because they're like, why didn't it work the first time? Because I was, a lot on like panels and things like that, and people always like, I hate that trope because, why if it didn't work the first time, why would it work the second time? So I think I like the childhood, crushes to lover in terms of those because in my story especially like they were they grew up together but then they moved apart and then now they're coming back together as adults, so like obviously their affections and feelings have changed. So that's another thing to second chance romance, like that people hate that because I feel like if they were awful to each other the first time around, what's changed since then.
Good point. Can work with that though, right? Okay, so if you made a checklist, what are some of the essential elements needed for a romance book? RJ, let's start with you.
Well, I think that one of the things that seems to frustrate people outside of Romance Landia is that we do have these very specific elements, right? That we as romance readers and writers kind of hit these. There are these notes, and they love to say, "Oh, that's a formula," and why does the formula have to work that way? And I'm very adamant that because we say so, uh, we say that it has to go this way. So, I mean, I think that romances have to have those elements of conflict. For me personally, especially being a seasoned woman, I like to see, like Noreen just mentioned, I like to see people changing and developing as they age, because this is absolutely a thing that can happen. We may be jerks when we're younger, but like, time and experience kind of sometimes can help us to be better people. It can also help us to be better able to receive love and give it in healthy ways. And that's one of the reasons why I think that conflict is really essential. Like for me, I like to see that the couple can face obstacles and that they can get over them in healthy ways to maintain a romantic relationship. Like if they never face any conflict, I mean, again, from just true life experience, if you don't face those issues and they never come up, like how can you really have a happily ever after? You never know if this person is really going to be able to work through this stuff with you. I also think that there should be characters who can be a bit rakish, like I do in my reading. I tend to like those jerks, but not like the irredeemable jerks, right? Like you can't, there are some things that are just irredeemable. But like, I think that it's necessary to show that there's ways for people to grow in the story. Like that's story writing 101 anyway.
Good point. Yeah, I like that too. Ananya, how about for you? What are items on your checklist?
Yeah, so big thing for me on my checklist is I think romantic chemistry comes from individual characters, kind of like what RJ was saying, but I like to really develop characters as individual human beings, right? Because a romance novel is not just two people coming together, falling in love happily ever after. It's also these individual people with their own sets of problems that are actively choosing to kind of meld them together and all the conflict that comes with that, right? So for me, I think good chemistry in a romance novel comes from having characters with their own individual goals that then help influence the way that they act in their relationship. Because I think, as we all know, when we are dating someone, like our childhood comes into play, our upbringing comes into play, the problems that we're currently facing come into play, and it would not be, this huge, incredible romance if we're not talking about those really real world elements that influence it. So that's a big item on my checklist. And I'm also a big fan of the third act breakup. I know that's like considered like controversial now, but like I think in every couple there has come a moment where you have to reevaluate whether this is right for you or not. And as much as it's not maybe as dramatized as the third act breakup in a novel, that like point of do I move forward or do I go back is there for every love story. So I think it would be doing yourself a little bit of disservice not to make your characters face such a like difficult choice, but then still having them choose each other. I think that's a very rewarding pathway. So I'm a big fan of that.
I love that. Thank you. That's awesome. Okay, so on the opposite end of that question, are there any elements that you don't recommend be included in a romance, or maybe just things that you personally don't prefer in romance stories in general? Ananya, why don't we stay with you?
Things that I don't prefer in romance. I write contemporary romance and I write it for young adults in particular. So because that's my demographic, I don't like enemies to lovers. And that's also apparently a very controversial take. But my reasoning for it is I think when you're a teenager, having an enemies to lovers arc sometimes can be a little bit brutal. I think that 17-year-olds that are enemies with each other don't know the line. And especially if they're not in a fantasy world where like, okay, you're a prince, you're allowed to be a little violent, like this is part of your world, fine. In a contemporary setting, enemies to lovers almost always turns into a form of like a precursor to an abusive relationship, especially when they're children. So I'm personally not a fan. I like rivals to lovers. I could read an academic debate team, like, they hate each other because they're competing kind of vibe, like Never Have I Ever. But I think enemies to lovers is where I draw the line because I have yet to see it be done in such a way where it doesn't feel like the couple is actively hurting each other and then falling in love because they've created some sort of trauma bond. But that is kind of like my hot take there.
Okay, we take it. We appreciate all takes, even if they're hot. Yeah. Noreen, how about for you?
Okay, can I answer the last question too, the one that you talked about, the beats? So I think for me, the beats are important in a romance, and like how these characters act separately from each other and how they come together, and to kind of meld this into what you're asking right now. The history is important. So like, I think I kind of agree with Ananya when she said the enemies to lovers sometimes is a harder trope, because if they've had history of like hating on each other, and they have those wounds from each other, like that's almost like traumatic to me, like, and getting over that. And yeah, rivals to lovers is much more to me believable in terms of like, okay, they're competing for something and they're on different teams, and that's why like that comes into play. But if they're like enemies and they're like at each other's throats constantly, I mean, it can work for people if it's done properly, but to me, I don't know, it's kind of like insta love in terms of like, okay, the affection develops too quickly. And same thing in enemies, are like they hurt each other all the time and then it's all forgotten in the name of love. I don't know, for me it's kind of like hard to like digest in terms of like history of a couple, because I really like to explore history of characters apart from each other, and then when they come and how they've changed each other throughout the conflict, and how they handle conflict with each other, without each other. So if they're like constantly against each other, I feel like to me it's very hard to come away from that. So that's one of the tropes that I am not a big fan of. Can it be done properly? Yes, absolutely, like everything else, but I don't know, like I probably couldn't do it because I just feel like I write these characters with lots of history together and it's just hard for me to do that. And the second thing, obviously, I'm not a big fan of insta love where people just see each other at the mall and they're like, oh, you're my destiny. Like, I don't know, there has to be a lot more that goes into it. Like, like I come from a culture of arranged marriages where, my parents like saw each other and like then spent the rest of once before getting married, and then they spent the rest of their lives together, based on, you know, mutual love, trust, and, you know, facing difficulties together. So yeah, I mean, it also depends on what, you know, what type of characters you write and what kind of tropes you write and what kind of story you're trying to tell. So, you know, I think with a lot of like multicultural stories, there has to be a lot more things that they're bound to, these characters are bound together by.
Thank you for that. RJ, how about for you?
So for me, there are some things that, as I mentioned earlier, are irredeemable. I cannot abide romances where the power dynamic is uneven. I love historical romances, but like there was I guess a movie series or something on one of the streaming services just a couple years ago that had like a Black woman who had been enslaved or something like that, and she fell in love with like the master's son, and I was like, no, I don't think so. Because to me, that is, it's kind of that romanticizing of these atrocities. And I really hate that. And so I don't like that part because I think that it's not true to history. It's also not true to, it's not acknowledging those dynamics. Like you can't really have agency if you're not free to say, I opt out of this. And so that can kind of be the case in those situations. Another thing that I think that just shouldn't be included in romance is it's okay for the characters to be unlikable. They can be sort of jerks, but they can't be the kind of people who, let's say, harm animals. Or people who have been abusive, but have not gone to therapy. Like I'm all for second chances, but you have to put in the work. And so for me to feel for those characters and say, okay, because I said a few minutes ago, everybody deserves a romance. I guess not everybody, but if you deserve it, I feel like you need to kind of earn it. So if you're gonna be a character that's done some real sus things, I'm gonna need you to like fix that on the page. Like no pretend stuff. I need to see that happens. So yeah, I think that those are the kind of things that I just can't abide. I mean, ugh, yeah.
Yeah, got it. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's talk. You share tips on how to build that romantic tension between your love interests so that you're evoking those strong emotions from your readers that are going on this journey. Noreen, can we start with you?
Sure. I think for my books, because they are sort of, you know, on the lower end of the heat spectrum, I tend to develop intimacy, you know, beat by beat. So obviously, romantic beats are meet cute, then, you know, intimacy, and then, you know, they fall in love, confess to love, then break up, and then they get back together. Those are sort of the standard romance beats. That most romances have, and they obviously have to end in happy ever after or happy for now. Now I know that people people sometimes like to see these be like, don't like the third act breakup. So like I have different people have different opinions about that. I mean, I like the third act breakup personally because I feel like the characters need to get together and then need to be apart from each other to like understand the dynamic and the, you know, the actual love between each other. Because I feel like if you're constantly with the person, you don't know how worthy they are of your affection until you've like broken up or have spent some time apart. I think couples should spend some time apart in order to realize what it is that they're missing. But I've seen it done where there is no third act breakup, and you know, there's like a, you know, curve, almost like a bell curve. You know, you progress and then you come down and then eventually you get your happily ever after. So the point I'm trying to make is there should be like increasing levels of intimacy, you know, throughout the book before something catastrophic happens or something which separates them, which makes them realize each other's importance and why they should be together before they come back together, you know, something like that.
Makes sense. Perfect. Thank you. RJ, what are your thoughts on some of those tips?
I think that when I see romantic tension done well, it shows, like Noreen says, that these things happen in stages. I think that for me, when it's most successful to see that romantic tension building is when the characters are also learning about themselves. So, for instance, a character might not know that, that might not be cognizant of the fact that they're always taking care of everybody around them. And so, in that moment where they're being cared for, I like to when creators kind of play around with that moment of realization that's like, huh, I kind of like that. It kind of makes me feel a little warm and fuzzy inside. What's happening here? So like playing around with that discovery process, because I truly think that a person who brings up the best in you is going to lead you to learn and grow within yourself. And so I think that that's kind of important for the tension. But I also agree with Noreen that there are also moments of intimacy that have nothing to do with sex or romance, though, that actually lead into this. Like that moment when somebody's able to recognize your hurt, they're able to recognize that they're interested in something that you feel other people usually aren't. Like those are small intimacies that I think can kind of lead to that romantic tension, because by the time the characters do come together in these love scenes, you're like, yeah, you earned that one. That was great. You needed that treat.
It's much more satisfying at that point. Yeah, I agree. All right, awesome. Ananya, how about your tips?
Yeah, so I think for YA, like there is no way to really build intimacy through sex because I don't write about teenagers having sex. So the way I like to build romantic tension with my characters, I'm a big fan of, like RJ and Noreen were saying, developing those characters and having them enter these tower moments where they find themselves wanting to lean on the other person, right? So I have like multiple scenes in my book where I have this like female main character who's just so used to being like this eldest immigrant daughter, doing everything on her own, handling it, and even having her mental breakdowns in this like corner by herself where she can like deal with it. And she meets this man who's willing to do anything for her, even if it means seeing her at her worst. And so I think when you have that sort of dynamic of a push and pull, you are kind of effortlessly creating romantic tension without thinking too much about it, because the characters themselves are having that tension with each other. They're bringing out sides of themselves that they've never seen before. So that was more on the tension side. For the romantic side of things, I think that communication is such a lovely thing in the world. I like to build a lot of relationships through healthy communication, through characters talking about their feelings, characters being vulnerable with each other, characters creating safe spaces to be upset and to be angry and to take all those emotions out, but to also resolve them together. And I think that also creates a really strong romance on the page because you see that they are more than just a kiss or an intimacy scene. They are fully devoted to each other as human beings and as individuals, and they're willing to help each other grow. And I think that's the kind of love we want for ourselves. So readers tend to resonate with that on the page as well.
Very good point. Thank you. Okay, so as a story is progressing, do you have any words of wisdom for how to keep your romance in your story interesting and fresh until that final page? RJ, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, the good thing about romance and human relationships in general is that there are like an infinite number of experiences that we can use when we're writing. And so I like to pull from those. I mean, again, I have a lot of life experience to pull from. But anyway, but also there are times when I'm writing a story and I'll go back to like the classics. Right. I'll go back to like the romantic movies, the black and white ones, where, you know, maybe they're having a moment where, you know, they have to share a set of pajamas, you know, because I just can't think of anything else. Right. Okay. Right. And so those are things that kind of keep it fresh because a lot of people don't see those movies. A lot of people have forgotten them by now. And so I think that that's kind of a way to get ideas about maintaining the romance, but also romance can be found in the tiniest things. Like I know here around my house, romance to me with a house full of teenagers and young adults is my husband going to get breakfast for everybody on a Sunday morning. Right. And then I'm just like, oh my gosh, I love him because he's feeding everybody. Right. And so, I mean, there's romance in just the very natural. Like I remember an experience where I'd never seen a certain kind of a flower. And the guy that I was dating went and found that flower for me in a field and just brought it to me. I mean, of course, it was all bruised, and I felt sad because like you killed it. But I mean, it was such a romantic moment. And so I think that just thinking about these tiny things, these things that we think are irrelevant, these things that we think are not important, that in the realm of getting to know somebody or building a romantic relationship, these things can be priceless. So I suggest like looking to those very simple things.
I love that. Also, add me to the Sunday order. Maybe adopted, because that'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. We'll never know that you're here. There's so many.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Ananya, how about for you? Do you have any words of wisdom for how to keep the romance interesting and fresh?
Yeah, I want to agree with RJ. I was going to say the same thing. I think the little things in romance are what makes them stand out for you in the long term. Because even when readers pull out their favorite quotes and their favorite passages in a book, it's never the big like boombox over the head, like "I'm so sorry, take me back" scene. It's almost always the smaller things that the author put in there because probably came from some deeply intimate moment in their own lives. So, for me, I love a good scene where the character is sick and then the other character is like just taking care of them and they're sitting there in silence, but you can kind of feel the love building right there. Like you could be anywhere in this world right now doing anything that you wanted, but you're choosing to sit here with me and to take care of me. And I think that when you feel the romance is kind of slowing down in a book, the kind of instant knee-jerk reaction is to create more conflict, create more tension. But I also think that readers like soft scenes. Readers like fluff. And I think towards the end of the book, especially when you're approaching a huge climax, when there's going to be a lot of bad stuff maybe happening, like a third act breakup, there's nothing wrong with having a scene where the characters are just so deeply in love with each other that the reader is like, well, when is this going to go to shit? To excuse my language, but when is this going to get bad? And I think that kind of also pushes people towards the end of the book a little bit more too.
Awesome. Thank you. Noreen, how about for you? What are your words of wisdom?
I think in general, like I love writing like these characters with like different stories, right? Different backstories and their wounds and and how they sort of come together. And obviously nobody can heal the other person, but why is this particular person important in whatever this other person's faced in their life? Like my debut, he is adopted and he has trust issues, and when he takes care of Sana when she's sick, like he realizes how much she does for him when she stands up against her family for him, and he realizes like not everybody is like that. Like you can trust people and you can build upon that trust. So like there's certain things that these characters they bring out in each other when they're with them to sort of falsify these long held beliefs that these characters have had, and they sort of act as a catalyst almost, because the change has to come from within you. Like nobody can change you unless you want to. So like the love acts sort of like a catalyst for these two characters to change, to, even if they're imperfect, to be sort of perfect together as a unit, because one complements the other. So yeah, I think that's what I do in a lot of my books, as the story develops and as they're falling for each other.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so you're talking to someone and you're giving them advice. They're thinking about getting into romance, and one of the concepts that they are considering is the steam level. So how do you decide what steam levels you want to include in your romance? Like, do you have a chili pepper spice goal, or do you just roll with the story? Do you add and subtract later? Like, what is your process for deciding that steam level in your stories? Ananya, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah, I have a lot to say on this topic, actually. So I wrote my debut when I was 17, but I'm 21 now, writing my sophomore novel, and I'm currently being told by my publishing team to think about moving into adult romance. So, I'm growing up with my characters and also discovering what STEAM level matters to me in my books and my own life, how this manifests itself in different couples, like having those big questions. So for me, at least in YA, I do feel pretty passionately that like teenagers should have sex and sex positive YA books should exist. Whether they should be fully open door is something that I, will argue about because I do think these are minors and their like sex life and their romantic life. I touch on it in my second book. I do think it's very normal for a lot of couples to have sex underage, but I don't know if it's necessarily our place as adults to be writing that on the page for other people to read. I think there's a line there. But I started writing adult romance, and I think that STEAM level is dependent on your characters and on your couple. Not every couple has the same chili pepper rating as another couple in real life, and I would not expect the same for books either. I think there's a pressure now with like book talk and like spicy book talk that everything should be super spicy all the time. But I also I read and write like really South Asian romances. So I think the way that we express intimacy is not always just sex. And I don't think that makes that any less of a love story or of an adult romance than a book that has quite a few sex scenes. That being said, when I write my adult romances, I try to judge what the character would do. So if this is a character that acts a certain way in person, you can kind of tell how they would approach sex in their own life, how they would engage in it in their romantic relationship. And then I let the characters kind of run that for me. I don't try to necessarily plan it in advance.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Noreen, how about for you?
So I, right, obviously my books are more character driven, and I mean, I don't think like there's one way to do this correctly, or because I do write adults, so like there's a lot of open door books, but I think for me, what I feel most comfortable writing is developing intimacy between these two characters in other ways than having sex. And obviously my characters like me are Muslim and practicing Muslims, so there's obviously no intimacy and things like that before they get married. I have actually, the third book that I'm writing is the arranged marriage trope, where they sort of are forced to get married to each other and then they fall in love. I mean, they're again childhood friends that they eventually fall in love. And there is some like scenes where I mean, they kiss. There's no sex, like open door sex there, but it's implied and things like that. So obviously, you write what you're comfortable with, and you write because it's going to show. If you write something that you're not comfortable writing, that it's going to show in the way your characters act and the way your characters behave. So for me, I write what I feel is natural for my characters. And eventually maybe there'll be a time I'll write open door, but I think at this point I just do a closed door type of romances.
Thank you very much. RJ, how about for you?
Well, I've written the gamut. I've written everything from the sweet or the closed door all the way into erotic romance. And I absolutely let my characters tell me what they're going to do. So like they come to me and they go, "Girl, no, we are not doing that." And I say, "Okay." Or they'll say, "Listen, you are restraining us and we want to do all this fun stuff." And so they're like, "Get out of our way." And I go, "Okay." But it really boils down to, like Ananya said, like you have to think about what your characters would do. Like the way that you've crafted these characters, would they be the kind who would be exhibitionists? Like maybe, maybe not. Would they be the kind who thought that holding hands on a date was like the height of impropriety? Maybe, maybe not, right? So I think you have to kind of let your characters tell you what they want to do, because I things do not go well when I, as the creator, try to force them to do things they're not trying to do. They're like, how about we just are gonna go away? We'll see you later. Bye, girl. So I have to definitely listen to those characters and let them tell me what their sex life is like. Like, I don't know. I don't know.
You're just the fly on the wall, basically. So love it. All right. So for authors who might like to follow in your footsteps, can you please walk us your writing process and what you do to stay on track with your goals. Noreen, can we start with you?
So my process is basically crying. No. I have writing groups, which are great for accountability. I personally think, because I'm the kind of person who needs to be held accountable. Otherwise, it's just all vibes and no plot for me. So yeah, so having a writing group is a great idea. And people think, oh, we all have to be romance writers and find other romance writers. Like, I'm in two different romance groups. One is all romance writers, and they are very good with the genre expectations and telling you, all the things that a romance should have. But I have another group, which is a mixed group of authors, and some of them are just readers. And those are great because they're your cheerleaders. So you do need critique partners and alpha readers and, writing groups, but you also need like cheerleaders to like help you finish a book, because writing a book is hard. It's not easy. It's like just pretty much for the first draft showing up. And my process is just vibes in the beginning and just like zero drafting, which is what I'm doing right now, and crying a lot during revisions because I am not a plotter. I have tried. I get hives when I see spreadsheets and like people having these massive like things where they're like writing on whiteboards and things like that. That all is just not me. So my process is just like having a feel for the characters and having like some points like how it's going to end, and having character sketches basically in my head, and then I just go with that and finish a draft. And like I said, it's not everybody's process, and some people need that plotting sheet, and some people are like absolute pansters where they don't even care where the story is going. They just have to write that first draft. And like, I will say that the first draft is you trying to tell yourself the story. Almost most writers that I know go like 2 or 3 drafts before it's even like in any shape to send to an agent. So, write that story, show up, even if it's crappy, even if it has like run-on sentences and grammatically not correct and shorthand or whatever. Just put the words on paper and finish that first draft, and editing it will come later. That's a future you problem. So that's my sort of process, and that's sort of my advice to the writers who are trying to get their first draft done.
Thank you for that, Noreen. And I'm just going to take what you say and have a shameless plug for the Right Hive Discord, which can be a great therapy session if you need it. It's year round. So shamelessly, if you'd like to join us on our Discord, we'd love to have all authors there. So RJ, how about you? What is your writing process?
So I used to say for years that I was not a plotter, but I realized that that's not quite true. I am a head drafter though. So I do a ton of drafting inside my head. And I absolutely cannot start writing the story until I understand who should be telling the story, what they're actually talking about and doing, and what some of the major plot points are. Like, why does this story need to be told? Why does it need to be written? And once I work all that out in my head, like sometimes that can take a couple of days. Other times that can take years before I figure all that out. Once I do that, then I actually have to put my butt in the chair and put my hands on the keyboard. I think that that's one thing that that my students don't always understand. And I talk to less seasoned writers and they're just like, oh, well, I mean, I can just write a book. I mean, like, in a day, like, is it hard? And I'm going, ooh, good luck with that. Fine. Yeah, and I'm gonna like sell it and they're gonna like send it to auction. I'm gonna make all this money. Like, no, you can't think about any of that when you're writing. Like, if that's what you get into this game for, you are in for a really rude awakening. Like, nothing happens instantaneously in this world. Like, even if you self-publish, you cannot just press go on these processes. And so it's really important to be realistic, but also to write because you love it. Write because you love the story. Write because these characters are people that have to be shown in the work. But the really important part is actually doing that. Even if writing longhand is the thing that you like to do, because some stories I write in longhand. The writing is very important. I don't think it's important to carve out, like some people work with routines. My life is ruled by chaos. And so, I may have 30 minutes to write this day, and then I may have 5 hours to write this other day. Those days may not be consecutive days. But when I'm on a goal, you have to find a way to get the story just done. You don't want to rush it. There have been times when I've rushed out on a draft and I'm going, that really sucks. And why did you do that? I really hate major rewrites. And so I like to kind of have a pretty clean draft by the time I get it done. But the most important thing that I would say in this process is you have to write the words to sell or publish the words. You just can't like make a sale on vibes. That does not work for any of us.
Unfortunately true.
Right.
I think that is really relatable. Also, I haven't necessarily heard someone frame it that way with head drafting, but it makes a lot of sense. So I could see how that works, definitely. All right, let's jump to Ananya. What are some of your writing processes and how do you stay on track with your goals?
Yeah, so honestly, my writing process has changed a lot over the last 4 years. So I do think that one of my biggest tips is like you're allowed to change how you write. There's not always going to be one true method for you because you're going to grow as a writer. You're going to enter different circumstances that require different deadlines and different goals from you. So being able to adjust and giving yourself the grace to change is a big part of writing, in my opinion. So, for me, when I was 17 and I wrote Kismet, I was in my freshman year of college and it was a mess. I was like, handling my classes for the first time. I was a neuroscience major. My classes were awful. I was writing because it brought me peace. And I think like going off of what RJ said, I never thought I would enter publishing. I was just writing because I loved it. And I was writing because it helped me have a space outside of science where I felt like my voice mattered. So that was really important to me. That's why I wrote this book, but I didn't have time. So I knew I had to get the words on paper because you can't edit, you can't sell words that don't exist. So I'm like sitting on the laundry room of like the actual like the dryer in the laundry room of my dorm at 3 a.m. writing this book. And my friends like find me during finals week and they're like, you haven't slept in 4 days. And I'm like, I know, but it's worth it. So that was what my process was like. I would not recommend that to anyone who's not in a similar situation because it can take a toll on other aspects of your life. But, now I've sold my second book and I'm working on my third, and I think I've kind of figured out the balance that I want. So I went from being a total pantser. I don't plot really, but I do like write a full synopsis of the book. I like to know what major beats I'm going to hit. It helped me feel motivated to keep going through the book because I think there comes a time where once you do sell a book, you start thinking, can I sell another? And the love for writing starts to fall apart. And, when that happens, writing just becomes the hardest thing in the world. And that happened to me with my second book. The imposter syndrome was really hard. But what got me through it at the end of the day was finding the motivation by thinking ahead, thinking about what I wanted my characters to do in the future and actually writing that down. Allowing myself to skip around in the draft. I used to draft chronologically, but now I draft whatever I want to draft because I think the motivation of writing is way more important than I guess the discipline of writing. It doesn't have to be in order if it means you lose your love for it. I think you can bend the rules a little bit there. Things like that. So I guess my biggest advice really is that my writing style has changed like 100 times in the last 4 years and will continue to change depending on my needs, especially as I, go to medical school and start becoming an adult and all of that. So I don't think that's only something that I will experience. I think all writers at all stages of their life will have to come to a point where they might need to change. And I think it's okay to do that as long as you are still maintaining your love for writing.
Such great points. Thank you for sharing that. Very valid. Okay, so I want to stay with you, Ananya, on the next question. What are some of the surprises or unexpected learnings that you've come across while writing in this genre?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing I've noticed is that the Western storytelling arc for romance is very different than the romance stories I grew up with because like I said, I'm Indian American, grew up on Bollywood movies. I grew up with a certain way of love being shown on screen and love being accepted by audiences. And so when I wrote the first draft of Kiss My Connection, it was written towards like the lens that I grew up with. And that was almost a little bit alienating to people that were not willing to look beyond the traditional Western romance lens. That being said, I do think my story is somewhat of a sign that you could still get into traditional publishing without the Western storytelling angle in mind. It might just take you finding the perfect person to champion that, which is a little bit more of a harder game to play. But the biggest surprise for me was having to explain to people, the reason family is such a big role in this romance is because they're Indian. Family's huge. Like, they're not going to just fall in love with anyone. They're going to talk to their family about it. And apparently, that was like this really weird thing for a lot of like editors that were starting to read Kiss My Connection when I was on submission. They were like, this feels like a really odd B plot. I'm like, no. This is influential for the romance. This is like a community driven story. Love in South Asian like communities is about more than just the couple. So I think I found it surprising how much I had to go to bat for my characters in that context. But I do think that goes back to the point of you have to write the book that you love so that when you end in a situation like that, because I think all of us will at some point, you are okay with kind of being like, this is how the story works. I'm not going to change it. And I'm going to find the perfect person who's willing to accept that there are different ways to tell a love story and help me push it out to the people who actually want to read it. And I think if you can do that, you'll be able to get through those weird surprises. But I still think about that where I'm like, I had to tell someone that a family is allowed to be in a romance? Really?
Well, you had to go to bat for it, but I think what I'm hearing is that you probably also paved the way for additional authors who can come right behind you. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So Noreen, how about you? Do you have any surprises or unexpected learning?
Yeah, I think writing is very therapeutic, right? Because there is a lot of things that you find out about your characters and even about yourself as you're writing these characters. Um, a lot of, like I said, like Ananya said too, my storytelling is based in being a Muslim and being an Indian Muslim, and how being a minority in India and being a Indian Muslim growing up in India, how that's impacted identity of a lot of Muslims that were there, and how that's shaped their storytelling. So what seeps into a lot of my characters unknowingly sometimes is that I don't want to say trauma, but like, the intergenerational trauma that immigrants have when they pack up everything and move here in search of a better life. Obviously, it seeps into your storytelling, it seeps into your worldviews, So I was surprised by how much of that my characters have inherited because it is me who's telling the story. And of course, when you try and sell a story that is like that, it's very unusual sometimes for editors. And they, like for my first book, we had a very difficult time selling my book because almost all the editors wanted to change the story where they should get together like earlier in the book and end the book right there. And I was adamant. I was like, no, this is my the male character. He was adopted and he had to go back home and like settle some of the things that he was struggling with, and we couldn't just end the story right here. So like I was surprised at how adamant I was on like, no, this is his character arc, and I don't think it's going to be complete until he goes back home and reconnects with the family that he thinks like gave him up and things like that. So it's like a lot of those things that you discover about yourself as a marginalized author on things that you're willing to give up, things that you're not willing to give up. And like you said, it paves the way for other writers, and then they don't have to struggle as much. You know what I'm saying? When they're trying to sell their stories, especially there's so few like hijabi Muslim stories that are written, which are not about them being oppressed. Like a lot of these stories are about, these girls who are oppressed, and that's why they wear the hijab, and, they take off their hijab and they fall in love with somebody who's not a brown character or not a Muslim character, or they hate their families and they feel pressured by them. So I wanted to kind of tell stories about happy Muslims, and we are normal and we are happy. Not all of us are oppressed, and not all of us wear the hijab because we're being told to, and how the characters are sort of okay with that, and the stories don't revolve around just that. They're about them falling in love and finding other things, just like all the other people around them. So yeah, though, I mean, in a nutshell, that's what I would say. I don't want to take up too much time.
No, we love it. I think what you're saying is resonating in our chat, so I appreciate that very much. Thank you. RJ, how about for you? Any surprises or unexpected learnings?
Yeah, so like I've been around forever, and one of the things that is disappointing, but yet the aftermath is actually pretty exciting, is the way that the support group Romance Writers of America used to be like this behemoth of support for romance writers, and like for years and years and years they were just this amazing group. And then so just here a few years ago they just sort of imploded because of racism, because of marginalization. And I was like, we've already done this though. Do we really have to come here again? Like, are you really surprised that a Black character could be a scientist? I mean, really? Or that they could have multiple degrees? I mean, like, hello, I'm right here. I exist. I'm really right here. So that was pretty disappointing. But what I found that kind of came out of that, though, is that Romancelandia is actually more than just the RWA. And so it wasn't like the romance genre crashed along with that support system. What actually happened is we just kept on pushing, right? So romance writers still kept writing. We kept binding together. I'm really excited too that romance is the genre that actually accepted self-publishing as being an authentic way to get your story out there. Like I know that Tar is kind of playing around with some of this, like indie pubs are doing well, but like self-publishing has not always been a thing in these other genres. And so I think that romance writers have sort of written that book on that. One other thing I do find disappointing though is that there have not been any more romance short story markets. Once the Confession Mags died, and then I remember years ago, again, 100 years ago, it was either Woman's Day or Woman's World used to publish like a short romance story. I'm not sure that they're still doing that. So as a short story writer predominantly, I'm a little disappointed that no one's come up with like markets for romance short stories. I'm like, I dig it so much. Can we do some more of this? So yeah, lots of learning experiences.
Well, you never know. You could be talking it into existence right now. So
yeah, hopefully.
All right, so this is the last question of our planned questions. We will jump over into the Discord after this and answer the questions that our participants have been posting there. So for our final question, I wanted to go around and ask, Write Hive's tagline is writing the future we need. So what does that look like to you within the romance genre? If I could start with you, Noreen.
Sure. I think for me it would be, obviously it's kind of full circle we came. I began with I wanted to see more people like me, hijabis like me in romance. And I think that's the future I want to see, is like everybody being represented in romance in happy stories, not just our traumas, not just our stories about like, being oppressed or things like that, but like happy stories, and and how we interact with the people, and like accepting the different forms of storytelling. There's not just like Western type of storytelling, but there is a lot of different ways you can tell a story. And like the future generation being exposed to all these different stories and different forms of storytelling, and sort of open their minds to these other worlds. I think that would be my hope.
I love that. Thank you. RJ, how about for you?
Yeah, I would like to see, again, everybody kind of get their love story. I mean, like, I would love to see, our hood girlies like find their happily ever after and not be shelved in only urban fiction lit. That's wonderful and that's great, but like romance has its own thing. And so I'd love to see that. I'd love to see the rural girlies that are not into the farm life. They just happen to live in these isolated places. I want to see them find their happily ever after. I want to see the divorced chicks that have a whole bunch of kids that they're bringing into the marriage find their happily ever after. I mean, like, I think it's really important that we show, I mean, billionaires are great and they're nice, but like, there's only so many of them. And so we all can't hook a billionaire. We all can't be like gosh, I don't know, a neuroscientist that saves the world and wins, a national, international prizes. We all can't be those people. So like the future that we need, in my opinion, is that where just regular people can still indulge in the fantasies and can be romanced and can, find their person or their people.
Yes, please. Thank you. Ananya, how about for you?
Yeah, I'm gonna echo what everyone said, but I also think that, I guess for me, when I first started writing romance, a big person that I looked up to was Sandhya Menon, because I think she was one of the first people in 2017 when Dimple Met Rishi came out, where she was like, I'm gonna write an Indian American love story where there is no Caucasian love interest and you will like it. And she was one of the first to do it. And I remember thinking, I was 15 when I read that book, why can't I do that? And so that's what Kiss My Connection became, where it was like, you are allowed to have a love story with the person of your culture, and it's not a cliche. And I think that it's not a cliche part is what the future that I'm hoping to see, which is that you can see a marginalized story represented in 100 different ways, and not one of it feels cliche because they're all very lived experiences of the diaspora. And I think the minute, writing and publishing gets to a point where you have that many voices at play, I'll be super happy. I think that's the future. Like, I want my kids to grow up in where they could find a book that represents any part of their identity, not just one, because there's only one voice at the moment. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Perfect. I love that. Thank you so much. And so on that note, we are going to go ahead and wrap up this panel as far as the presentation here. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for providing basically a masterclass on all things romance. You all were perfect. We are going to go ahead and jump back over into the Discord to continue answering the questions there from our Right Hive attendees. For last words, final go round, I'd love to just quickly let our viewers know any projects you would like to plug, and then how can we find you after the conference if you're willing to share your social media links or your websites. So Ananya, why don't we stay with you?
Yeah, I'll start. So I mentioned this earlier. My debut actually comes out in 3 days, and I will be going on tour in Irvine, LA, San Diego, New York City this upcoming week.
Nice.
So if you're in any of those areas, I would love to see you there. I'll put my social media links in the comment section here, and all the information is there. But a big part of being a 21-year-old Gen Z Indian American author is trying to do well in the market. So it would really be helpful to me if you pre-ordered my book and if you supported someone who's just starting out in this industry, because I can keep writing my stories and keep telling them. And I think that would mean a lot to an Indian girl somewhere in this country. So that's all I have. I'll put my social media links down below now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Noreen, how about for you?
Hi, everyone. My debut is coming out in October and is called The Misarrangement of Sana Saeed. I will put all my links, social media links on my on the chat and also in Discord when I jump on Discord. And I'm here to answer any questions you have. And please buy my book or pre-order my book at this point. And I will be on a couple of more podcasts. So follow me on social media where I can keep you more up to date with all the play. I am going to be in Doylestown signing books on October 26th. So I know it's quite a ways from here, but that's one event that I've already scheduled. But please follow me on social media and pre-order my book. I'll drop a link in Discord and here, and support all the authors that are here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And RJ?
So my latest publication is this horror story collection. So if you like your a horror with a lot of romance in it, I'm not going to call it romance because it does not hit those beats. There's quite a few stories that have the romance. And I will be at StokerCon next week. So this collection is up for a Stoker Award in the fiction collection category. I'm really excited about that. And so if you kind of like these love stories that have a little bit of gore, maybe, or a couple of monsters, I mean, hit me up. I'm your girl.
Perfect. All right. Well, we've got our Red Hive Army ready to support you all. So thank you so much. That wraps up our panel. On behalf of Red Hive and our panelists, thank you for being here today. Have a great rest of your conference, and we will definitely see you over on the Discord. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.